Welcome to season 2 of Fresh Off the Boat. My name is Arjun Seth, and I'm the founder director of EdBrand and College Fair Live. I'm delighted to have Tivrat Garg joining us. Today, he's an assistant professor at University of California, San Diego. And I'm still an admissions counselor, Tivrat. So why don't you introduce yourself?
I am Tivrat Garg. I'm an assistant professor of economics at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California in San Diego. I specialize in environmental economics and climate adaptation in low-income communities around the world, but particularly in India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia.
Great. So we're going to rewind a little bit and go back to high school. So this segment of podcast is more to get toward listeners who are students or curious parents who want to know about the journey of different students. So how did it all begin? Like, what did you think about while you were growing up about studying or further education? How did it all fructify? I know we met and I identified a few schools and we discussed a few things, but by and large, what was the thought process as a high schooler? And what advice would you give kids who are interested in researching colleges?
Oh, I think I'm a little too dated now to give advice on how to research colleges. I think back at I was applying to colleges in 2005 because I started college in 2006. So wow, it's been 17 years. So I think it's like I think the competitive sphere, the information sphere has considerably moved. But I think that one of the things that does remain true about the academic experience in the US is that there is a lot of flexibility and you sort of get some space and room to grow into what interests you. And I think that there's a lot of value in doing that, whether you're doing that at sort of the undergraduate or the master's level. So a lot of my instinct was that I really enjoyed economics as a subject. In 11th and 12th, it was something that really piqued my interest. I relate to it. It's something I realized that I wanted to do more about with a technical focus. So I don't even know if we're still doing, the standard streams in high school in India, but that was sort of my take, was that I wanted to focus on a rigorous approach to economics. I think the mathematization of economics at the time, at least, really appealed to me, and I found that intellectually exciting, and I decided to pursue that in my collegiate studies.
Great. And today your focus is so interesting in development economics, and which would cover environment also, and that's one of your focus areas. So as a high school student, how do you define environmental and development economics to a high school student? What do you know now, or what should they sort of prepare for when they think of studying this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that in high school, I also to some extent incorrectly had the impression that economics is about money and business and finance, and that couldn't be further from the truth. I think, yes, economics talks about money in the form of incentives, but really economics is the science of human behavior. So anything that any aspect that touches on human behavior is a topic of interest to economists. And so what they're really interested in is understanding how people respond to various kind of stimuli, whether that's financial incentives in the form of, say, a paycheck, whether it is behavioral incentives, whether it's emotional incentives in the form of behavioral nudges, like just the act of, for instance, if you're interested in understanding charitable donations, the act of seeing someone in less than ideal circumstances or in poverty, then that elicits you to donate. That itself is also an act of human behavior. It's an understanding of human behavior, and therefore the purview of economics. What I'm particularly interested in is how do we take our understanding of human behavior and apply it to environmental problems. So how do we think about the effects of climate change on the poor, and particularly what's the role of government policies in helping reduce those damages? How can the poor adapt to climate change? We know that there's going to be a certain amount of temperature increase no matter what we do on the mitigation side, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There's going to be a certain amount of temperature increases, and these effects are going to be unequal. So the way you want to think about that really is that if you care about the environment, then there is, and you care about how humans are interacting with the environment and how they can be asked or made or encouraged to do things differently. That is entirely the purview of economics. So anything that touches upon human behavior, and the area particularly of applied microeconomics has really exploded in the last 20 years. All sorts of applications to health, crime, culture, environmental issues, development issues, behavioral issues, charitable giving, productivity enhancement, et cetera. Like these are all very much the purview of economics. So think of it less as, about cashing checks at a bank, and more about, how do people respond to different stimuli?
So very often students start with that notion, yes, looking at an investment banking or a consulting job as an end goal, but here you are, like you're doing something so unique and interesting and have a perspective on decision sciences in some respect, and economics as a tool perhaps to help those understand why people make those decisions. Fascinating. If you can, also talk about, as a college student going to the US, economics very often comes across as a very math-centric sort of curriculum, and increasingly so, I hear that from our students. Why is study of math and statistics so important for an economics degree? It's not the same here, so just that question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's entirely true. I think that there are programs even within India where you do have a more mathematical approach to economics. I guess it's two things. I think one is that by making it a more formal discipline that is based on mathematical principles, so you start with axioms and assumptions and work your way to the conclusions. What the discussions and debates that then happen are not so much around, could have various different motivations. Every conclusion that comes out of an economic model is going to have a political bent to it. Some people are going to like it, some people are not going to like it. So rather than talking about sort of end results, the formalization allows you to talk about the assumptions. And increasingly, like a lot of the focus of applied microeconomics has been not so much to just debate endlessly about whether assumptions are valid, but rather take those assumptions to the data and not just, apply a little bit of data, but really take large data sets and rigorously test those, through things like randomized control trials or, even quasi-natural experiments, to really understand whether the assumptions that we're making in our models are true or not. And I think that formal approach allows for a much more educated and a much more deliberate and purposeful conversation around what's going to happen when the government institutes certain policies, what's going to happen when we implement a minimum wage or we provide subsidies to the manufacturing sector. These are questions that are of fundamental importance to economic growth. And I think the mathematization or the formalization of economics allows us to think about that more rigorously. Now, having said that, I think in most instances, especially in graduate training, we have a lot of emphasis on intuition. We really want you to be good at the math, of course, but what we really want is for you to also develop that economic intuition. And I think increasingly a lot of undergraduate programs in the US are providing sort of dual tracks. If you don't want to be an economics major who's going to end up going to graduate school, et cetera, and you want instead to be somebody who has that way of thinking. I mean, ultimately economics, one of the most powerful concepts in economics is the idea of marginal changes. So rather than thinking about average outcomes, you think about incremental changes, and that ability to think at the margin, that way of thinking, has much broader applications that really can be done for without mathematics. So I think a lot of places have introductory economics classes that are not for econ majors, etc. So I think there's like options to like learn that style of thinking without necessarily being committed to a lot of formal mathematics.
Great. So these are tools, so to speak, or of course, some sort of a foundational toolkit a student could have to sort of make those intuitive assumptions and then sort of get to the bottom of the questions that they want to sort of get answers to. So it's really interesting that over these 16 years since you sort of graduated from high school, things have changed on the ground in India too, and many other countries. There are many more students who are interested in research even in high school, of course, propelled by interesting and new developments in pedagogy, teaching with the international baccalaureate curriculum and such that, which was so kind of new when you were graduating from high school. So there are many more kids who are really keen on understanding all that you mentioned, understanding research methodologies, controlled trials, and many other sort of buzzwords that go around that, which is very refreshing. However, students need direction, and you've been on the other side, which is now you're a professor. So it's interesting to sort of correlate and make it easier for a high school student who's very curious, really interested. What are the first few steps they should keep in mind if they want to get answers and work on research projects?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, because part of the reason why you're seeing more and more people being interested in research is that research is no longer the purview of the ivory tower. It's not the case that it's only people with very long academic careers who are interested in esoteric questions. I think a major chunk of industry, certainly government, is starting to realize that the bottom line in the case of private industries, or really the extent of service delivery, which is, not in many developing countries, that is the primary function of government, is service delivery. That can be just done in a much more cost-effective and better manner when it's guided by evidence. I think this emphasis on figuring out the body of what we really know, what really works, has permeated through business, through government sectors, et cetera. So a lot more occupations are requiring this as a core component of what the job entails. It's not just sort of about ideas that you're throwing around, but really like, how do you learn about what works? And part of that is learning the research process, even if you're not performing the research, but to be able to understand and digest that. So I don't think that's entirely surprising. I think it's a function of where the job market and where positions, et cetera, are being opened up. So I think in terms of where to begin, I think the idea there is that you want to sort of think about what interests you. What are the problems that you really trouble you? And I think reading sources such as, the Upshot in the New York Times, Times of India recently has a new column that is around sustainable issues, where they have researchers write. So I think accessing that in sort of non-technical terms is a good first place to start. If you're particularly interested in development issues, Vox EU and Vox Dev do a very good job of translating research into a broader audience that can understand them. Within India, there's a blog called Ideas for India that does a really good job of asking researchers to translate their work into something that's accessible to a broader audience. And then I think a publication that I think very highly of it that does this work really well is Economic and Political Weekly. And so these are places that you want to read and sort of get a sense of how people are going about tackling the problem. So rather than sort of thinking of this as one major problem, we use the approach of sort of developing and breaking down the problem into several buckets. It's also an approach that's used by a lot of consulting firms. It's called MISTI, which is mutually exhaustive, mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So you break down a single problem into its constituent independent buckets and then try to tackle each of those and then put the solution together. And that's really where and how we approach a lot of the research problems. And I think those are good places to start if you're at the high school level. Get excited about those. And if you find yourself excited by that kind of work, then maybe research is for you, and then you take on more classes and you learn more about how to read those papers.
Thanks for sharing the gems of wisdom in some sense, and also I think pointing the students to the resources out there. We'll probably put that in a note in our podcast and share it with the students who are listening. So moving on, I think we've got us insight into the academician and the person that you are and your interest in the subject. But yeah, going back to what is life at university, beyond, of course, college. How do you differentiate, say, a small liberal arts college which you went to, Lafayette, to a Cornell, or how would you differentiate life at UCSD, where you are now at? Some broad highlights would help, and then some insights or anecdotes would also be useful.
I think the usual thing that you hear, I mean, so keep in mind that it comes with this caveat that I work at a major university. It's a very large research university, but my scope of interaction is limited to a few disciplines. And even though I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, we're talking about 3 or 4 other departments. There's parts of UCSD that I have never seen, and that's certainly true even when I went to my graduate work at Cornell, a very large university again, and there's buildings on campus I've never been inside, and I was there for 5 years. So it's just, I think part of it is that when you're an undergraduate, your playground is the entire campus, and then as you go to graduate school, it sort of shrinks, and if you're a faculty member, it shrinks further. So I think that is something to keep in mind. I think the general thing that you'll hear is that liberal arts colleges offer a more personalized experience where the faculty teach most of the classes. They're smaller in size. You have more interaction with the faculty member. And larger universities have the advantage of having much more research active faculty who are able to, who are sort of at the cutting edge of where the scientific frontier is. And therefore you're exposed to sort of more of the cutting edge in that sense, but you don't have sort of the nurtured caring learning experience necessarily. I think that a lot of that is converging in many ways. Some of the top liberal arts colleges have some fantastic researchers who are at the cutting edge of their fields. This is certainly true at the top 20, top 30 liberal arts colleges. Certainly, when you think of the top 5 liberal arts colleges, their research productivity is equivalent to many leading universities, and publishing in sort of the top journals, etc. And I think increasingly, research universities are also realizing that they have a broader fiduciary responsibility to their constituency, which is their students, and really improving upon the education experience. Certainly at UCSD being a state university with a responsibility to the local community, to the state of California, and then broadly, globally as well. There's certainly a lot of emphasis on delivering quality teaching. Promotion and tenure decisions are, of course, primarily here based on research, but you can no longer be sort of a bad teacher and make it through those benchmarks. And promotions, salary raises, etc., are all taking into account the student experience and the extent to which how well are you, how effective are you inside a classroom. And I think a lot of faculty, even at the top universities, are starting to realize that one of the channels through which they will make their biggest impact is through training the next set of students who are going to go on being researchers or policymakers or business professionals, right? So if I care, one of the things that I care about, and I'm spending a considerable amount of my time working on, is how do we solve various aspects of the problem of climate change. And ultimately, I'm not working inside government, but I will have students who will be working in local, state, federal, national governments and in international organizations. And that's where we see a lot of that impact. So I think there's a convergence on what was sort of the traditional breakdown of liberal arts colleges and research universities. Now, certainly the idea of having lots of students and smaller student body is still an important difference. It also matters in terms of the scale of campus, whether you've got sort of buses running through campus or you can just walk around in a smaller. I think those experiences matter whether you're in a big city or a small rural area. But really, I think both of those things are changing, which is that liberal arts faculty are increasingly expected to produce high quality scholarship. That's certainly happening at places like Williams, Swarthmore, Middlebury, Lafayette. All these Vassar. These are all schools that are very well rated, and they're all producing faculty producing high quality research there. And at the same time, especially in partially state funded universities such as the University of California system, there's been a lot of emphasis on delivering very high quality teaching, because ultimately we are responsible for the student experience and student learning, and I think we take a lot of pride in that. We like to be thinking of ourselves as a place that produces some of the world's best scholarship, but at the same time produces some of the finest trained students who go out and do some very exciting and interesting things.
Thank you, Tira. This was just fantastic to catch up and learn so much about your field of interest, and even just listening to the journey. And it's been unique for me. One of those, aha interviews that I've done. Great moments all through the conversation. So thank you, and look forward to catching up with you.
Yeah, good to see you as always.